So we're getting ready to assemble one of these steam wands, and you're going to need a bunch of parts for this, and the one below there is the one we took out of the machine, and then I've kind of arranged a set of new parts to show you what is involved in the assembly. So I just wanted to hop out to the parts website here that we've put together. We've put a lot of time and energy into trying to get a good parts website put together. For right now, especially the Franke machines, the Evolution, the S700, because they're a really popular machine. We put this Evolution parts manual together. It is something that I had done a long time ago, and then a colleague of mine just poured a ton of effort into to get kind of cleaned up and ready for its debut here. You can use this bookmarks navigation to quickly like hop around to sections of the machine, and we're working on the auto steam, so I'm gonna drop down in here and kind of show you this section. Now the first part we work on in that video is this little brass piece they call like an axle or something. You can't quite see it up in this picture, but it is there. It's at 2280. If you go down to the list here and find that 2280 and then click on these links, it'll bring you right to the page. The first thing you got to do when you're working with a new component, especially this piece here, new one, they're very sharp. There's an O-ring that sits in that seat right there, and in order to help that O-ring seat properly, I'm just taking a sharp knife here and kind of putting a chamfer on that corner, making sure that sharp edge is gone. Getting that O-ring to seat in this piece right here is one of the more difficult tasks, oddly enough, of putting a steam one together. Once you get this O-ring seated in there, then everything's good. I also kind of put a little chamfer on this plastic piece to help that O-ring slip through there. You'll see in a second why that's important. And I do use thread lock to put quite a few things together on this machine. It's pretty important, especially on this steam wand. And I'm trying to add just a little bit of thread lock to this part. I'm looking through the camera lens, so I don't have any depth perception. It's kind of hard to tell. But and then it looks like this can insert from either side, but what I was trying to show you there is that the O-ring goes on the other side with that seat. There is a slight difference in that part. And when you tighten this up, you need to get the sides of that hexagon kind of in line with the sides of that brass piece. I was kind of giving you a shot at the end there to show you what that looks like. And I was just building up a new steam one here. I'm actually, the old steam one I had, it was so worn out, I just kind of everything in it needed to be replaced. And so I was taking this opportunity to show everybody how this assembly goes together. I use a little bit of this oil on all these O-rings. It really just helps everything kind of slide together without tearing up the O-rings or having them catch when you don't want them to. And this next part is arguably the most frustrating part of trying to assemble these steam wands, and it involves getting this tube through that plastic piece and screwed into that brass section without ruining that O-ring, and with also getting that O-ring seated properly so that you don't have any steam leaks after you get this thing assembled. And when you're screwing that upper steam wand into that brass assembly, you can kind of see that O-ring peek through right there in that black plastic section. And then you want to screw it down just until it touches, and then turn that upper tube until that flat portion is exposed to either side of that brass axle part there. And I'm just kind of showing what can happen to the O-ring. I've removed that black plastic piece just so you could kind of see what that interface would look like. And in that upper, that O-ring was pinched. And you can kind of tell if you're successful or not just by holding this up to a light and kind of looking through that gap and making sure that O-ring's seated properly. I'm just using a bit of thread lock again to put this set screw in. Small things like this can be difficult to tape and get a good seal on, so thread lock works good. It doesn't have to be a high strength thread lock either, just kind of generic works really well. And then when you tighten this down, you're kind of tightening it on the flat of that upper tube, and you want it snug but not too tight. If you go too tight, you'll deform the tube and make it almost impossible to remove later on down the road. So just kind of snug, and that thread lock will keep that set screw tight, and it shouldn't let that tube pivot in there. This fitting seals using a O-ring, so it just needs to be snug. You don't have to crank down on it or use Loctite or thread tape. It actually has a little O-ring that meshes on that interface. Now we're getting to the second part of what could be considered maybe the most difficult part of assembling this steam wand. It's kind of a toss-up between that O-ring and inserting this temp sense probe. You can see I put on like a really good pair of like rubbery grip gloves, because you got to have just a really good grip on that steam wand to kind of force it around the curve. And I put a little bit of oil on there to try and help even more. You want to be careful when pushing that through there. If you're pushing up too high on that temp probe, you risk the chance of collapsing the tube or bending it, and you can't kink it or anything like that, or you'll ruin it. So once you get it far enough through the tube, it's much easier and safer to pull it from the other end than to keep just pushing it through. And that cord, the electrical cord, is very delicate, so you got to be very careful with it. Once you get it through there, then you can kind of slide this little brass nut down, and you got to teach one of your hands to kind of hold some tension on that temp probe and hold on to the tube at the same time, and then you can just get a couple of threads started on that brass nut before you tighten it down. There's an O-ring in there that seals that steam from leaking out that end of the brass nut there. And so again, this is another connection where it doesn't have to be screaming tight, it just needs to be snug, and that's more than good enough for that connection. The next thing to do is to get some O-rings lubricated so that you can put together this lower steam tube, and you're going to use that tube here later on to help straighten that temp probe that we just shoved through that upper assembly. And you want to be really careful when working with these O-rings. I use a little like pick set to kind of help them over that shoulder and get into the seat where they need to reside, and you can poke these or cut them, and then they're going to fail prematurely, so just be really careful when you're slipping them over those shoulders and down into the seats. If you're interested in any of the tools I use in these videos, I try really hard to put links for them down in the description, and those are all Amazon affiliate links, so purchasing stuff through those links helps support us, but it doesn't cost you anything to purchase things through those links either. So one of the most recommended tools I could ever give to somebody is that DeWalt cordless drill. I don't know if I use it in this, but I use that drill every day, and it's one of my favorite things on the planet. So I've almost got this lower steam tube assembled, and you'll see most of the time, like with these, I don't use anything to tighten them further than just hand tight, but there is one exception on that coupling, and I'll show you that here in a minute. But everything else should just be hand tight. I mean, you want to be able to take this stuff apart in your stores and everywhere else, just so that you can clean it properly and replace an O-ring from time to time if you have to, without having to drag out a bunch of tools. It's pretty important that this temp probe is fairly straight too. It just helps with getting that lower tube on and off there and not having to fight it so much. So when you're putting this in a customer's location, you want it to be really easy to take that lower off for cleaning. When you shove that temp probe through that upper, you get this little bend from having to go around that tight radius, and I found the best way to kind of straighten it out is to turn the lower tube around and use the steam nozzle section in order to kind of straighten it. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but the straighter the better, and the easier the assembly will go. Now there's one last final detail, and I like to use this lower pipe to get that coupling screwed into the upper. And what you want at the end of the day is for that coupling to be tightened into that upper, and when you remove the lower, you want the coupling to stay with the upper half, and it just really helps with assembly. And that tight bend up there and the steam temp probe will kind of cause interference with that coupling, but if you kind of tighten it into that upper, it'll help everything kind of come apart and go back together again when it's in the field. You'll see here in a second, I'll take a pair of pliers and kind of tighten that coupling back up into that upper just to make sure that it stays there when the lower half is taken off. Well, that's about it for this video. If you guys are finding this content useful or entertaining, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. We'd really appreciate it. Again, all the tools used in this video are in the links in the description below, and appreciate everybody watching. We'll see you on the next video.